Good morning, and a warm welcome to you. We've already heard why we're here. My name is Fumi Olonishakin. I'm Vice President responsible for international engagement and service at King's College London, and it's really my pleasure to warmly welcome you here, and I hope that this is the beginning of, many great conversations that our panel this morning will lead off. I would like to make 3 sets of points by way of introduction. First and foremost, I think I need to express our sincere thanks for this collaboration to the Lord Mayor, but also to an alumnus of King's that we're very proud of, Alderman Tim Hales. Thank you for starting us off this morning, and thank you for hosting us this morning. I think to many of us, we're no strangers to King's College London, but we keep trying to adapt. And the subject of this morning is one that gives us real cause for adaptation, locally, regionally, globally. And I myself, having served at the United Nations for a few years, at the time that we were talking about the Millennium Development Goals, I realized that the point of having this conversation is simply that the question of poverty, as you said, is not one that is the preserve of any one group of people, any part of the world. At King's, we have been trying to bring our knowledge to bear in service of society. And in the last couple of years, we started thinking carefully about how to align the wonderful partnerships we have across London, across the United Kingdom, and globally as well. But we call ourselves a civic university at the heart of London. And that has to mean something. It has to really speak to the kinds of partnerships and conversations that we have. What we've done in the last 2 years is to ask ourselves, how can we best be in service of our society locally and globally by pulling together all of our strengths internally, amongst academics, amongst our students, but also build a community, a true community with our local community. We've had a long-standing relationship with the City of London. How can we come together to really make sense and share a collective purpose? And this conversation is only one part of the series of conversations that we've been having. And I just wanted to leave us on the note that as part of our mission to be in service of society in pulling those strengths, what we call the One King's Impact, which is truly in partnership across our local communities, has focused on 5 areas that we think we can usefully do something together. And the interlocking question of poverty, right, speaks so much to this. One is about social mobility. How can we ensure that no one gets left behind, regardless of what their background is? And I think some of our studies around the question of how we avoid creating unequal life chances is at the heart of this. And we'll hear some of this from the eminent panel here. But in talking about how do we avoid creating unequal life chances, that question of social mobility dovetails with the whole question of climate and sustainability that we're talking about, that the whole world is grappling with at the moment. But it also talks about peace, security, and justice. I want to lay emphasis on that question of justice. And as we are grappling with all of this, technology is changing, leaving many people behind even. The question of how do we live well with technology is at the core of that. And finally, we cannot talk about the question of poverty without addressing good health for the mind and for the body. As a knowledge institution and as knowledge institutions across London, as people in our local communities, businesses, and the city that is grappling with this issue, we need to start having a genuine conversation. And that's what this morning is about. And it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone. And I now want to invite Bobby Duffy, who leads our King's Policy Institute excellently, to begin to introduce the panel and this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Tim and so much to Funmi for that great introduction. I am not going to say much more about the setup and objectives of today because I want to get straight onto our amazing panel who are going to have 4 minutes each to speak about their issues, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions from the floor and then more time for mingling afterwards. So I'm going to go straight over to Aqil, who is going to speak to us about global healthcare disparities and the ambition to revolutionise maternal health inequalities around the world. Welcome, Aqil.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Since I have 4 minutes, I'm going to get straight into it. Thank you for inviting me. Today I'm here to talk about my work on social determinants in maternal health. And I thought I'd start with the golden question, why? You see, as a second-year medical student, I decided to solo travel to Bangladesh, where I want to better understand global health inequities. Whilst I was over there, I was observing an emergency C-section, which went horribly wrong. I saw a newborn baby deny their first breath, a mother bleed to death, and a family fracture in front of my eyes. I came back to the UK, and I did my research, and I found out this is a very common story. Every 2 minutes, a woman dies from pregnancy-related complications. 95% of those deaths happen in the developing world. But the sad and shocking news is 90% of these deaths are completely preventable. This is a global crisis. That is why, as a second-year medical student, I founded MA, a non-profit with a vision to revolutionize global maternal health. And since starting the project, I founded it on 3 main principles. Initially, idea generation, where global health experts worked with global health graduates to create projects which was both sustainable and needed. Number 2, fundraising. We focus on public donations because as we increase our fundraising capital, we also increase public awareness on this much-needed topic. And finally, implementation. We created a grassroots team for flexibility and sustainability. And now I lead a team of 250 people in 4 countries. So far, we have encouraged global health activism in 60 universities around the world, 48 of them being from the UK, and students alone have raised over £1 million for the cause. One of our projects is creating healthcare facilities all the way from the primary to the tertiary level. This is an example of one of our antenatal clinics where we have full-time MA doctors who also provide telemedicine services. In summary, we have provided free maternal care to 500,000 women in total, and that was in the last 10 years. But then I started asking myself the question, are we just putting a very big bandage on a very big problem? So I started asking a new question. How do we leverage tech to solve global health inequalities? And quite accidentally, I fell on a startup idea called Gravida. It has 2 platforms. The first platform is for healthcare professionals. When they see expectant mothers, it works as a maternal health tracker using WHO-approved questionnaires. Very excitingly, we're working on predicting life-threatening complications like preeclampsia, postpartum hemorrhage in the first trimester using machine learning models. And finally, providing gold standard management. It can also be used by governmental bodies, giving a bird's eye view of what's happening in their regions. And we also have incorporated AI-powered reports to help with resource allocation and optimization. So far, since launching this year, we have created a partnership with the Department of Public Health and Informatics regarding the SDG goals. We're also looking into getting access to a database of 8 million women to power our machine learning models. And I'm very fortunate to mention that this year we were a startup winner at the Future Maternal Care Summit in San Francisco. My goal is to create digital villages where we power community mobilization and AI to solve global health inequalities. And I believe we can do that by educating a community, specializing a workforce, and connecting a fragmented healthcare system. Thank you very much for listening.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you. Thank you, Aqil. Incredible achievements, and in under 4 minutes. 4 minutes is short, isn't it? That is tight. Well done, Aqil. That's an amazing, amazing real-world impact. Thank you very much. Myles, go straight to you.
Thank you. Well, I don't think I'm going to be able to say anything quite as practical as that. That was a wonderful start and a very high bar set for the rest of us. I want to give you a little bit of a historical perspective, really, on the poverty issue, and particularly the international dimensions. And it was very much something I was part of in the 90s. I want to start really this narrative with the fall of the Berlin Wall, such an important point in history. And the East-West problems which had sort of hindered a lot of our sort of international relations, the North-South relationship, changed after that. We started to think seriously, what is international development about? What is the priority? And unsurprisingly, but rightly, we started thinking, actually, the key objective has to be to make people better off, to reduce poverty. And the North, because we then still spoke in these sort of North-South terms, the Global North came up with a set of so-called International Development Targets, the IDTs. And the key of these targets, there were 8 of them, the key one was halving the proportion of people living in absolute poverty in the world by 2015, using a 1990 baseline. And there were some other targets in there, essentially around basic health and primary education. Everybody thought this was mad. It was used, these international development targets were used very much as the basis for a white paper written by the new Labour government in 1997 when they came in. It was called Eliminating World Poverty, a Challenge for the 21st Century. And those international development targets were transmuted. They became, with a little bit of variation, the Millennium Development Goals, set in 2000, agreed in New York by everybody. And it was basically the same set of targets. And the key one was that target of halving the proportion of people living in absolute poverty by 2015. Lots of people thought this was a mad aspiration. What happened? 2 or 3 years before 2015, that target was achieved of halving the proportion of people living in absolute poverty in the world. How extraordinary was that? And progress was also made towards those other goals of health and education. So what came next? Well, you know, something had to take over from the Millennium Development Goals. Work started thinking about what the successor to the MDGs should be. Our then Prime Minister, David Cameron, was on a high-level panel which came up with this phrase, leave no one behind. And there was a very consultative process, and the SDGs were agreed in 2015 in New York within a few weeks of the Paris Agreement on climate change and environment. Everything looked pretty good, pretty rosy. And those SDGs, I mean, as people will know, there are 17 goals, 169 targets, lots of sort of indicators lying beneath those. Quite hard to remember what they all are, but the 5 key Ps that one has to remember are people, prosperity, planet, peace and partnerships. Those are the 5 Ps that have to come together. And poverty, reduction of poverty, is linked into all those others. The discussions in New York at the moment, a lot of them being around SDG 1, which is no poverty, SDG 2, no hunger, SDG 13, which is around climate and the environment, SDG 16, which Funmi mentioned, which is around democratic governance and structures and rights, and SDG 17, which is about partnerships, people, civil society, governments, and the private sector. But we need a 6th P, too, to make this happen. And this is my last point. The 6th P is political will. And we have to be responsible for helping to generate that political will. And I hope that this colloquy, which we all now know what it means, is going to help to inject that momentum and get us moving forward to eliminate world poverty before too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Myles. Fascinating context and history there, and again, brilliant timekeeping. Spot on, again, from Myles. Well done. So straight over to Stella, who's going to be speaking about harnessing diaspora skills and resources for enterprise and employment in Africa. Thank you, Stella.
Thank you, and here's hoping I keep within the 4 minutes. So to start with, there's no doubt that the African diaspora play a significant role in driving economic growth and development in Africa. The potential of diaspora skills, investments, and remittances is often underestimated, yet they represent a vital source of financing for the continent. Recent estimates continue to confirm that the diaspora contributes substantially to the economies of their countries of heritage, far exceeding overseas development aid and foreign direct investment. For instance, remittances alone exceeded $90 billion in 2023, and actually over 100 billion in 2022, with an estimated 25% directed towards investments in various sectors, including enterprise and employment. However, it's crucial to recognize that the figures do not fully capture the true extent of diaspora contributions, as they often exclude informal channels and unregistered flows. The African diaspora, comprising of millions of individuals, hold immense potential, with a very conservative estimation of combined savings at $33.7 billion. This financial capital, alongside intellectual, social, and cultural resources, can be harnessed to foster development and create decent jobs. To tap into this potential, innovative financing schemes are absolutely essential. One such approach is a match fund scheme, already in practice in a few African member states, such as the Gambia, Senegal, and Morocco. These schemes incentivize diaspora members to invest their skills and finances into socioeconomic projects, but there's still a long way to go in realizing the full potential of diaspora contributions. The importance of the diaspora, of course, extends beyond the financial support. They also bring in valuable skills and knowledge that can significantly enhance local enterprises. And by leveraging their networks and expertise, diaspora members can help to bridge the gap between local businesses and global markets. However, a number of small and medium-sized enterprises in Africa face challenges in accessing the necessary financing to grow. This missing middle is a critical barrier to economic development, as SMEs are responsible for about 70 to 90% of job creation on the continent. So to address these challenges, I'll leave you with 3 concrete solutions. We need to adopt a blended finance approach. This involves combining ODA with private sector investments and diaspora contributions. And by doing so, we can create a more robust financial ecosystem that supports the growth of SMEs and fosters sustainable development. Secondly, governments, multilateral institutions, and the private sector must work together to reduce remittance transfer costs. This action would return millions to senders and recipients, which can in turn be targeted to investment purposes for enterprise and employment. This aligns with the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular Target 10C, to lower transfer fees to 3% or less. Thirdly, structured programs that match diaspora skills to local enterprise needs are essential. Initiatives that promote volunteerism, mentorship, networking can add significant value to ongoing local efforts. And by creating platforms that facilitate these connections, we can ensure that the diaspora's contributions are effectively utilized. So to conclude, the African diaspora does represent a powerful constituency for economic growth and development. Their investments, skills, and resources can drive significant change in their countries of heritage. However, to fully harness this potential, we must implement innovative diaspora financing schemes with urgency, reduce the barriers to diaspora investment, and create structured programs that connect diaspora members with local enterprises. And by doing so, we can unlock the vast opportunities that lie within the diaspora and pave the way for a more prosperous future for the continent. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you. Thanks so much, Stella. Really important issue, and learned a lot about that as an asset and very practical solutions to how we make better use of it in the future. Thank you so much, Stella. And I don't know why I was worried about keeping to time. Everyone is doing it perfectly. This is really good. Next up, we have Eduardo, who's going to be talking about development economics and poverty dynamics measurement. Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm pleased to be here today to talk about the challenge of eradicating poverty. The vision of a world without poverty is not only a commitment embedded in the SDGs, it's also a moral obligation. I would like to comment on three things that I believe are critical if we are to truly achieve this goal. First, we must discuss what it actually means to end poverty. Is it sufficient to simply raise the incomes above a defined poverty line, or must our approach be more comprehensive and enduring? To truly fulfill this goal, I will argue, we must focus on chronic poverty, poverty that is persistent, intergenerational, and deeply rooted in structural disadvantages. Addressing chronic poverty requires us to look beyond temporary income support and consider the more complex factors that keep people trapped in poverty. And this is a very crucial concept. A poverty trap is a self-reinforcing mechanism that perpetuates poverty. Without the ownership of critical assets and without the ability to use them, individuals are unable to generate sufficient income to escape poverty. These assets, which take the form of physical, financial, social, or human capital, are essential for improving and sustaining livelihoods. My second point is that poverty is multidimensional, and it requires a multidimensional approach. By recognizing that the different dimensions of poverty are interconnected, we can develop more effective policies. For instance, a lack of education can limit access to good jobs, which in turn affects income. But also, having education but being excluded from labor markets can entrench individuals in poverty. These are not just temporary setbacks, they are structural factors that, unless addressed, will keep people trapped in poverty, regardless of economic growth. My research reveals that households facing both income poverty and assets deprivation today are significantly more likely to remain as income poor over time. This finding underscores the importance of targeting chronic poverty through policies designed to build these essential assets and to build an environment that enables people to exploit their assets. Finally, my third point is that in our pursuit of the first SDG, it is important to acknowledge a critical nuance. There will always be a degree of poverty due to the volatility of incomes. People might fall into poverty temporarily due to unexpected events such as illness or economic shocks. This form of transient poverty is challenging but inevitable. Therefore, when we speak about ending poverty, we must focus on eradicating chronic poverty. We must focus on breaking poverty traps. This means investing in education, healthcare, housing, and social protection in a way that builds the critical assets people need to move out of poverty. For example, ensuring that every child has access to quality education is not just about meeting an SDG target. It is about building human capital and economic opportunities that will yield returns over a lifetime. Moreover, addressing poverty also means building resilience against shocks. The pandemic has shown us how quickly progress towards the SDG can be reversed if we do not have robust social systems in place to protect the most vulnerable. In conclusion, the path to a world without poverty is complex and requires more than just economic growth or cash redistribution. It requires a deep understanding of the underlying factors that perpetuate poverty. The SDGs are a collective ethical commitment to ensuring that every person has the opportunity to live a life of dignity and equity. And by committing to this shared responsibility, we can create the conditions for sustainable poverty reduction and move closer to the vision of a world where poverty is truly a thing of the past. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eduardo. And you can start to see the connections between the different speakers there with very much a link to Myles' points about the interconnection between the SDGs and how we need to see it as a whole. Very good. Next up, we have Louise, who's going to be speaking about progressing SDGs through private sector partnership.
Great, thank you. So a little bit of context about why I'm here today. So I've worked for Accenture for 27 years. And 20 years ago, I spent a year volunteering in Cambodia, working as a management advisor. And I saw firsthand the role that business skills and business thinking play in eradicating poverty. And so for me, that was a huge tipping point in my career. And for the past 20 years, that's been my focus. We're a $64 billion revenue organization, 750,000 employees. So the question I grapple with every day is how can we use the skills, the capabilities, the resources of a company as big as ours to actually help to address the SDGs? 84% of SDG indicators are off track, and we are not going to achieve them if we don't have a healthy and vibrant private sector. We know that we don't have the political will that Myles mentioned, unfortunately, in many cases. Public funds are going down, so we need to get more private capital mobilized. But there are many challenges to that. We see a lack of enabling environment in many countries. We have a particular focus on lower middle-income countries, and we see that many businesses are reluctant to take the risks. There's too high cost of capital, and so we're not seeing the investment at the pace that we really need to see. So we need to focus on that enabling environment, and we also need to focus more on galvanizing business. We saw that research we did last year that there was actually a significant drop in mention of the SDGs by businesses, and they were focusing purely on ESG reporting. So whilst that is also very worthwhile and valuable, it really risks a much more narrower focus of where businesses are putting their time and resources. So if we think about the role that business plays, gosh, there are so many, so in the few minutes, I'm just going to pick a few. Clearly, we've talked about wages. I mean, it's absolutely critical in terms of wages, driving profits, and that economic part is critical. But as Eduardo mentions, it's not just the economic part, it's the role that businesses play in also supporting their employees through healthcare, through access to finance. So it's that much broader meaning of being in a job. But that means we need decent work, not just any work. We need to focus on social protection, living wage, workers' rights, and try and support people to transition from the informal, formal economy so that they get access to that kind of support. Secondly, through the types of business products and services, we see microcredit markets booming. We see companies like AXA, MasterCard, Microsoft and others investing in digital and financial inclusion, all hugely important, but they can't do it alone. They have to work and partner across the sectors. So SDG 17, absolutely critical in terms of cross-sector partnerships to make sure that the products and services are what people actually need and are tailored to the communities and customers that these companies are trying to serve. And we've got a long way to go. 1/3 of people still aren't connected to the internet. And when we are all inundated by what AI is doing and how fast it's moving, there's a huge risk of just massively exacerbating this digital divide. And what does that mean in terms of people getting into jobs and being able to lift themselves out of poverty through earning an income? Actually, what we're seeing is a huge need for more skilling with digital skills to make sure that we don't fall into that trap. And finally, action on climate. There is no doubt that the private sector has a huge role to play in addressing climate change. Yes, we have seen progress. We've seen companies sign up to net zero targets. We've seen a bit more action on nature, but we're a long way from where we need to be, and we really need to accelerate that action on climate. So to close out, 3 key messages to take away. We cannot address poverty without the private sector, and so we need to make sure that we have the right enabling environment for businesses to invest. We don't just need any jobs, we need decent jobs so that people are paid a living wage and get that support outside of just pure financial earnings. And finally, action on climate. The private sector needs to accelerate its focus on climate, as climate is increasingly going to be a driver of poverty. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Louise. Perfect timing again, and you can again links into Stella's points about using all of our assets to deal with these very interconnected challenges, hugely important. Straight over to Will, who's going to be talking about what a fair society and economy could look like in London and across the UK.
Thanks. I'm going to talk about how wealth inequality is much more damaging than we realise, and also how fairness can help us to define the problem and build a consensus for action, which is more or less what Bobby said. So wealth inequality, as well as inequality of other forms, harms society like carbon monoxide harms the human body. It damages our economy, damages our democracy, our social fabric, our public services and our environment. And each of these aspects of society supports the others. So when one starts to fail, it can have a domino effect, multiple organ failure, if you like, on a grand scale. And we believe that inequality, in particular of wealth, is a barrier to all of the new government's missions, such as reducing NHS waiting lists, boosting economic growth, and breaking down barriers to opportunity. Unequal societies are less healthy, less productive, less efficient, less resilient, and less cohesive. And ours is a society suffering from the carbon monoxide poisoning of inequality of wealth, income, health, education, between regions and people of different ethnicities, genders, social classes, and disabilities. And on our current trajectory, things are going to get worse over the coming years. Today, 30% of children in the UK live in relative poverty. This is projected to increase to 33% by 2028, while the SDG target is to halve poverty by 2030. And let's be really clear that many of the same mechanisms that drive wealth at the top of society also drive poverty at the bottom. Fairness, I think, can help us to define the problem and to build this consensus for action. And of course, fairness sounds a bit wishy-washy. Everyone's pro-fairness, but isn't that because we all think about fairness in different ways? People on the right of politics might focus on fair process. Those more on the left worry more about fair outcomes, and no one really knows what fair opportunity actually means. Well, I think it's possible to define fairness in a clear way that speaks to these different priorities while guiding people towards a shared consensus about what a good society looks like. And at the Fairness Foundation, we talk about fairness in terms of 5 fair necessities. Firstly, fair essentials. Everyone's basic needs should be met, so no one lives in poverty, and everyone can play a constructive role in society. Second, fair opportunities. Everyone should have a decent chance to succeed in life. So that means removing the key barriers to equal opportunities, and I would put wealth inequality at the top of that list of barriers. Thirdly, fair rewards, that hard work is rewarded on the basis of people's contribution to our society and economy. Fourthly, fair exchange, that people should contribute to society by paying the taxes that they owe, and in return be supported by society when they need that help. And finally, fair treatment, that everyone is treated according to needs, but also that people enjoy equal respect and equal influence on the decisions made in their name. Now, we've polled the public in the UK 2 years ago and found that 3 in 4 people in Britain support these principles, with fewer than 10% opposed. And we've done extensive polling to show that Britons are not only concerned about inequality, especially of wealth, but also supportive of bold action by the government and other actors to tackle it. And no wonder, because unfair inequality is not just bad for those living in poverty, it also damages our society, economy, and democracy. And I would go as far as to say that inequality is a strategic risk to the UK. So we believe the case for action is unanswerable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Will. What a powerful image of wealth inequality as carbon monoxide poisoning society. It really makes you think. And a focus for our work at the Policy Institute as well, in terms of how do we actually deal with that. So we're going to go straight over to Shabna, who's going to talk about structural racism, inequalities, and impact on communities. Shabna.
Thank you. I am delighted to have been invited today to speak on behalf of the Runnymede Trust, which is the UK's leading racial justice think tank. The problem of poverty has long been a focus for us at Runnymede. It's sadly a persistent racialised experience where some communities of colour are exposed to poverty at far higher rates than the white British community. Whether it's relative poverty, deep poverty or destitution, we know that there are certain communities of colour that are experience that at far higher rates. For example, we know that Black African and Black Caribbean households are 3 times more likely to experience destitution right here in the UK. And that's where we're talking about people are not able to meet their basic physical needs to stay warm, to stay dry, to stay clean, and to be fed. just a short distance from here in Tower Hamlets, we've got 35% of Bangladeshi children living in poverty. I was born in Tower Hamlets in the 1970s to migrant parents, and we lived in poverty then. In 2024, the persistence of that racialized experience continues. We know that this isn't a homogenous experience and that it differs and is shaped by gender, by generation, by migration status and geography. But the persistence of that racialized experience of poverty continues. But we argue that it's impossible to understand poverty without understanding wealth distribution, so picking up on something of Will's point. Because actually, when we look at poverty and wealth, we see that they are both racialized experiences. In a report that we published before the pandemic called The Colour of Money, we looked at how it is that people of colour generally have much lower levels of wealth and assets. When we compare to white British people, we find that for every £1 of white British wealth, Pakistani households have around 50p, Black Caribbean households have around 20p, Black African and Bangladeshi communities have around 10p. At the Runnymede Trust, we argue that you cannot fix poverty without making the explicit connection to wealth. We cannot ask who doesn't have enough without asking who has too much. So fixing the structures that manufacture poverty and its racialized impacts are inextricably linked to fixing the structures that manufacture and protect wealth hoarding and the accumulation of excessive wealth. And so understanding and fixing those structures requires us to think in quite radical and transformative ways, to move beyond individualistic and meritocratic explanations and narratives that blame victims of poverty and celebrate wealth as markers of individual success. As we're located here in the City of London and in the financial capital and in this very glorious building, it would be remiss of me not to point out that these current domestic and global economic structures and inequalities have their roots in historic and global relationships that go back to slavery, to empire, and to colonialism. It's less than 10 years ago that we stopped paying off the debt for the loan that the British government took out to compensate British slave owners for the abolition of slavery in 1833. The extraction of wealth that came from colonized countries, for example, from India, is estimated to approximate to $45 trillion. That came to the British state, to this place that we're in now. So our current financial and taxation systems, which manufacture poverty and protect wealth accumulation globally and domestically, have to be understood in this broader framework. At the Runnymede Trust, we take a 3 T's approach. We talk about triage, about thinking about poverty and poverty relief, thinking, for example, about the 2-child benefit cap. We think about transition. We think about how to build different systems that will work beyond giving us minimum income and basic thresholds for survival. But we also urge the fact that we need to think about transformation. We need to advocate for an entirely different economic system, one that is rooted in principles of anti-racism, equity, and care for people and planet.
Excellent. Again, really powerful contribution from Shabna. And I think, again, seeing the connections between the different speakers. We're getting nearer the end, so if you can, as an audience, you start thinking about those connections and questions that you might want to put to us or conversation points that you want to start. So we're going to go straight over to Suzanne, who's going to be talking about King's research on the impact of cost of living crisis and how to mitigate its worst effects. Suzanne.
So good morning, everyone. With 1 in 4 Londoners living in poverty, the cost of living crisis has hit the capital hard. So the Policy Institute at King's conducted a mixed methods study with Londoners in the college's home boroughs of Lambeth, Southwark and Westminster. There are 4 key findings that I wanted to highlight about how people are coping and what changes they want to see. The first is about the importance of language. For many participants, it really was a case of crisis, what crisis? They spoke about living through the A, B, ABC of British politics: austerity, Brexit, COVID. This meant that the cost of living crisis is nothing new to them. It's a continuation of difficulties that they've faced for over a decade. But they worried about thinking about it as a new problem would point policymakers in the wrong direction when trying to think about solutions. The second is about the significant changes people were making to cope with the constrained financial circumstances that they found themselves in. These included cutting back and skipping meals. So in the survey work that we did with Londoners, over a third said that they were spending less on food and other essentials. Our peer researchers really brought home what this meant in practice. Carpooling with your neighbours so you can go to the supermarket, shopping at the end of the day so you can make the most of the reduced price items, eating the same meal for weeks and weeks on end because it means you can bulk buy and that means you can get things cheaper, sleeping in jumpers so you can keep warm when the heating is off. They're also seeing family and friends left. Again, over a third mentioned that they were doing this as a way of cutting back on the money that they're spending, but this carries a different kind of cost. People spoke about being lonely. They spoke about being cut off from the sources of support and resilience that they need to get through difficult times. They're also relying on savings. This was mentioned by a quarter and credit by 1 in 10. But running these funds down and credit card bills up means that you're reducing your resilience and your ability to weather shocks when times get hard. The third is the impact that these changes had, most notably on mental health. So 3 in 5 said that the rising cost of living had a negative effect on their mental health, and this was playing out in a number of ways. So a third said that they were avoiding the news because it made them anxious, and 1 in 4 said that they were having problems sleeping. There's also the shame people felt and the stigma associated with getting help and support. And they contrasted this with their experiences in lockdown when there was much more of a sense of being all in it together. And the third is just how difficult it is to live like this. Linathan and Datta, who are behavioral economists at the Harvard Business School, speak about cognitive bandwidth. And they say how for people living precarious lives, their cognitive bandwidth is overloaded because they're having to make so many more decisions all the time. And our participants spoke about this. They spoke about how difficult time was, but they also spoke about being exhausted, about having to consider everything all of the time. So the fourth point, just to inject a little bit of positivity, is that in spite of the years of difficulty, people can still imagine a better future through bold reforms which address the root causes of inequality. Participants mentioned more affordable homes. They talked about nationalising energy. They also talked about the importance of moving away from means testing as a way of reducing stigma. So free school meals for all was advocated by the participants, not just for children on things like pupil premium. So as one participant in Lambeth said, it's investing in children's health and development. However, while participants could imagine a more hopeful future, they didn't trust our politicians to deliver it for them. 2 in 5 think that the political system no longer represents them, while participants in the workshop said of the last government, this just isn't a government that wants to help people. So as we face down what's going to be another difficult winter for Londoners, where people face high costs but have been worn down by years of struggle, we should keep in mind that it's not enough to deliver the policies that people need to help them. But instead, we need to turn our issue, as well as we need to turn our issue to the issue of trust, what the Prime Minister referred to as one of the great battles that defines our age. And we need to build confidence that we can deliver the change that people need to see. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Again, very powerful messages and directly from peer researchers make such a difference. And so we're going over to our final speaker, Kari, who is going to share some of her personal experiences and also talk about the power of community organising as a force for positive change in this area.
Thank you. Buenos días a todos. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kari, Citizens UK community organizer. I work with low-paid workers on the Living Wage campaign, as well as Spanish-speaking families in King's College award-winning program, Empoderando Familias. As a migrant single mother from South America, having worked low-paid jobs in education, I experienced firsthand how hard it was to get to the end of the month, even on a full-time wage. As a primary school worker in Wandsworth, I saw a child saving food in his school uniform pockets from his free school meal. He told me this would be his dinner. This brought anger and frustration inside me, as I told this child I would do something to help him and his family, not knowing what I could do beyond referral to a food bank. This led me to the Living Wage campaign and getting involved with Empoderando Familias Parents group with Kings and Citizens UK, which is now my job. Now I organize with Spanish-speaking families and workers in South London. Latin Americans are known for being hard workers, right? I organize with parents working so hard, particularly in the cleaning sector. They are living in poverty, in work poverty, on zero-hour contracts, exploitative agencies, minimum wage salaries, working multiple jobs just to make the bare minimum, unable to spend time with their children, and leaving their older children caring for the younger ones, and missing out on university and school and a good education. For most of us in this room, London is our home. But most of the people cleaning it cannot afford to call it a home. But as I mentioned before, we are very hard workers. We are organizing together to make London a living wage and living hours city, where everyone has enough hours and high enough wage, £13.15 per hour, to make London their home. This year we have taken a lot of action, including a South Bank living wage walk, a Halloween action at Tate Modern, and a full play on the steps of the National Theatre performed by workers. We're thrilled that this year Tate Modern, Globe Theatre, and National Theatre have accredited with the Living Wage Foundation. 1,000 workers on the South Bank, mostly cleaning staff, have had a pay rise as a result. Did you hear that? 1,000. Poverty doesn't affect everybody, but these are the people living it every day, the people keeping our city clean and running. This campaign brings hope and brings them drive to continue to make London a city where they feel valued. This is a work in progress. This issue cannot be solved by the low-paid workers alone. We all have a part to play. So I will leave you with one question. What role can you play to make London a living wage and living hours city and end in work poverty?
Well, thank you so much, Kari. What an incredible way to end an amazing session of different contributions from people. Huge appreciation to all our speakers. So this is the time for your questions and comments, and I'll probably take, if I can, if we have a few, I'll take a couple at a time, 2 or 3 at a time, because it's likely to be a mix of specific questions for individual speakers and general points. I did see you first, so I'm afraid I'm going to bring you very quick and very keen. So we bring down the front first. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for noticing me. My name's Caroline Ericks, and among other things, I'm blessed to be a mother to 2 children. They're now non-dependent children, but they're still my babies. So thank you to the doctor in the corner. Forgive me, what was your name again?
Aqil.
Aqil. Thank you, Aqil. Thank you so much for mentioning bringing to the attention of all of us a topic that is, in large parts of the world, taboo these days. And thank you so much for everything you've done so far to elevate this topic and the work you've put in to design this app and advance this technology. I'm very privileged in that I've observed domestically our NHS board meetings, and globally the World Health Organization and the United Nations endlessly discuss women's health, maternity care, things like this. Now, one of the key points I'd like to make is that in all of these forums, both domestically and globally, maternal health is disproportionately discussed and the decisions are disproportionately taken by men. And the outcome of that is more, what are we going to do with women? What are we going to do to women? As opposed to working with the maternity sector, working with midwives to uplift the outcomes of childbirth and pregnancy and conception. And I'd like to invite you and respectfully ask you to embrace the wonderful maternity care that we do have and uplift it as part of your statistical project and your app project. But go further than that. I'd like to invite you to take on a challenge. Now, I don't know whether you are aware of Piers Morgan, but Piers Morgan did an interesting challenge on national television. He took the TENS machine challenge. Now, are you aware of the TENS machine? So a TENS machine is something that when you're pregnant, or anyone can do this, you strap this machine to your stomach and it creates the effects of early childbirth. And he took the TENS machine challenge, and it's all over the internet, you can watch it. I'd invite you, will you do the TENS machine challenge and see if you can last longer than Piers Morgan?
Great. Thank you. There you go. We don't usually get challenges, but that is a good one. We'll come back to you in a minute, Aqil. Yes, should we go in that corner and then we can work round? Yes.
Peter Dordor, Charitable Trust. I'm a bit depressed by the panel in that all you talked about was economics. What I would like to have heard is the problems from a perspective of sociology, psychology, religion, community, and even ecology. Maybe thinking about poverty as an economic problem is the problem, because when it comes to money, that is the tool of power. And if we start talking about community rather than money, I think we could do a lot better. On economics, and here's a question, why do economists never talk about rationing? There are enough bedrooms in the country for everyone to have a bed. If we rationed energy, all of a sudden we could control climate change. But rationing never gets spoken by economists. Does it put them out of business?
Very good, very good. Good direct question. I did say I would go to this person. It's third row. Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much. Chris Pond from Financial Inclusion Commission. I wasn't depressed by the panel at all. I was inspired by them all. I thought it was fantastic presentations, and thank you to all of you. It was Myles at the very beginning, or near the beginning, who talked about the need for that P, which was political commitment to achieve some of the goals we want. But of course, that political commitment is also constrained in so many countries, and especially in the UK, by fiscal constraints. There is very little that governments can do in pulling fiscal levers to address some of these problems. And we will see that played out in the debates in the House of Commons, I suspect, this afternoon over one particular issue. And so we need to think if there are non-fiscal means for addressing these issues. And both Kari and Louise referred to one important aspect of that, which of course is to make sure people have a decent wage and decent living conditions. Rather close to my own heart as somebody who campaigned for the national minimum wage back in the day when dinosaurs roamed the earth and I worked at the low pay unit. But there's another aspect of it, and that is to make sure that people are included in the financial system, which is so important as a mechanism for achieving resilience and sustainability. And at the Financial Inclusion Commission, we've recently commissioned some research from CHASM, the research institute in the University of Birmingham, at looking at what the reality is of financial exclusion today. Those 1 in 20 people here in one of the most developed financial services sectors in the economy, 1 in 20 who have no bank account, 1 in 6 who are in serious debt and need debt advice, 1 in 5 who have no savings whatsoever, who are actually on the edge. If between one broken down washing machine and disaster, they have nothing to fall back on. Now, if we can find ways of including those people in the financial system, of making sure that both digital and financial exclusion are addressed, and I have to pay tribute to Alderman Hale's predecessor, Nicholas Lyons, who, as Lord Mayor of London, actually promoted financial inclusion and financial education as a means of addressing some of these problems. That is one way in which we can perhaps move forward in non-fiscal ways to address these issues. I'm pleased that the new government has committed itself to a national financial inclusion strategy. We need to make sure that strategy is implemented as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Excellent. Great points. I'm going to stop there and take another round in a second. And I'll direct roughly 2 panelists, but do jump in too. But I think we do have to start with Aqil and the challenge that you've been set.
I wasn't expecting a challenge. I took annual leave to be here today, so... Oh, hi, Sam. So we had a... I know I'm a brown-bearded man, I'll be honest. So I go in these projects, and what do I know about maternal health? But what my project is about facilitating. One of this is, whilst I was in a health camp, just last week we saw 450 patients, absolutely free maternal care, given the current flooding situation and political situation in Bangladesh. Now, whilst I was in one of the health camps, someone mentioned to me that reproductive health and good menstrual hygiene is completely tabooed. And I thought, why? Why is that the case? They use old scarves and pieces of cloth whilst they were on their periods. And I said, that can't be the case. So what I did instead is, being a facilitator and being someone who's never experienced a period, I knew that was a problem. So I went into schools, I closed the doors, I got doctors and female teachers to go in, talk about reproductive health and good menstrual hygiene. But then I thought, let's take this one step further. I went to local bodies and I said, can you fund this project? Somehow the project came to £70,000, and I thought that was a load of nonsense, I'll be honest. I thought we can do this for much cheaper. So I worked on the project for 1 year. I went and I found a reusable sanitary pad that can last up to 2 years and cost less than a cup of coffee. So far, we provided reusable sanitary pads in these projects to 10,000 young girls. I haven't entered a single one of those classrooms. And going back to the question, I actually have heard of the TENS machines. One of the ways we fundraise money within the student population, being in King's as well, we used to give the machines out during a month project, and then male students used it, and if they could last a certain amount, they would have to pay a certain amount. So that's one of the ways we raise money. And yes, I will accept the challenge, maybe in the future.
Yeah. Excellent. We will come back to you with a film of Aqil and his TENS machine experience. Brilliant. So just moving on to the part about the question and comment and thoughts around the dominance of economics in this, and whether other disciplines or other ways of thinking around sociology, religion, ecology, this sort of starting with framing this as an economic problem is the wrong place to start. And I wonder whether anyone has reflections or thought of that. And I did put your name next to it, Myles, as a starting point.
Yes, that's a tricky one. Clearly, poverty is about all sorts of things. Poverty is about not having enough money to do the things you need. It's also about poverty of opportunity. It's not having the education you need to get to the next stage of things. And so I don't think it is, I think it is partly an economic problem, but it's also absolutely a social problem and a societal problem. And I think that's why the SDGs are so important, because they do bring these things together in a way that we've never brought them together before. And one point about the SDGs, let me just make this, it's a slightly broader point if I may, but I meant to make it in my presentation but didn't. The key difference between the Millennium Development Goals and the SDGs is that the Millennium Development Goals were essentially for the Global South, with support of finance from the Global North. The world has changed since the days of the MDGs. The SDGs are universal. And one thing that politicians in this country have not done, from whichever party or part of the political spectrum they are, is recognise adequately that the SDGs apply to the UK as much as they do to any part of the developing world. And some countries in the global north have really taken this seriously and have implemented them into their sort of social policies, their thinking, into departmental plans. Why don't we do that here?
Great, thank you, Myles. I think Will, did you want to come in on this too?
Thanks, yeah, and I should say I'm not an economist, but we recognise we did talk a lot about economics. I think there is a lot that can be said about some of the non-economic aspects of both poverty and inequality that doesn't get mentioned enough. And Shabna talked about meritocracy and some of these cultural and sort of psychological narratives that are quite dominant in this country in particular, and I think those are real barriers to progress. I think it's very problematic that because of those dominant ways of thinking, wealth inequality spills over into other forms of inequality, and inequality of respect and status and so on. And there are countries in Europe and elsewhere where, for example, wealth inequality spills over less into political inequality and social inequality. And I think those are interesting examples for us to look at, albeit that I would argue reducing the absolute level of wealth inequality is also necessary. You talked about rationing, and as you say, it's an interesting observation. There is a group of economists and philosophers and probably some sociologists talking about an extreme wealth line, a limit on the amount of wealth that any individual should hold and where that should be. Now, that's a radical proposal, but it's an example of some of those debates starting to come into the public discourse.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to come back to the original point where we started, and Aqil, the incredible work that you are doing and have done, and coming back to the maternal health question that you raised, because I think that, again, talking about it as a global or an issue that's out there and problem for Bangladesh on this occasion or globally, but right here in the UK, we still have persistent inequalities in terms of maternal health outcomes. So black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth or in their postnatal experience. Asian women are 2.5 times more likely to have that experience. And that's not just related to their direct healthcare experience, it's actually also related to their wider experience of the social determinants of health, again, linking back to poverty. So I think that kind of exposure to the kind of air pollution, for example, the housing conditions that deteriorate women's health in pregnancy and in that postnatal period, those are things related to poverty. So coming back to your point, Sarah, about the kind of wider arguments about going beyond economic arguments and models, I think absolutely it's really important that we take a global and a holistic kind of approach to understanding all of the different ways in which the assets and resources that we enjoy are not just down to money and material resources that we have, but they often are. And then the other thing about rationing, I think it's about the distribution of those resources, right? It's not about whether we have enough. The ecological point that you made, the planet has a limit in terms of what it can be, what further can be extracted. So there are actual limits to that are set both ecologically, sociologically, and I think that the kind of poverty experiences that we have are so holistic that we do need to take approaches that factor in the economic, the psychological, the ecological in how we approach and understand them. So I hear that point, but I think the maternal health point is a really interesting one to be able to look at how those experiences are so integrated with other aspects of how we live and experience the social and material world right here in the UK.
Absolutely great contribution. And I have to say, just as a personal reflection on that one, as I listening to the panel and looking at the work in this area more generally, I think the interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, different frames that are being brought to are actually one of the things that stand out to me, that this is not only looked at through one lens, and that is at the core of the SDGs in many ways themselves. Moving on to this third question that we had, which was about non-fiscal approaches to this, given fiscal constraints, and whether that's about financial literacy, the financial system, and maybe Louise,
Yeah, give me a mic. Thank you. No, I mean, I couldn't agree more about the role of financial inclusion. And we've seen it over the years where, I mean, we're going back maybe 10 years ago now, but there was 2.5 billion people unbanked in the world. And we worked with Barclays and 2 non-profits, Plan and Care, to actually look at how to bring village savings and loans associations, which were existing in many countries but weren't actually part of the formal financial system, into the system. And you just see, like you said, what it unlocks actually in terms of resilience. And it means you can create those loans, you can encourage people to take insurance and really build that financial inclusion and resilience that you don't see otherwise. We're seeing it at the moment. If you think about, very sadly, the number of IDPs, internally displaced people, refugees, actually one of the big barriers in terms of settling into new countries is how do you actually access a loan? How do you access credit to set up a business, have a livelihood? The amount of Ukrainian refugees I've spoken to who are highly skilled, highly educated, desperate to try and get a job here, and just struggling to make that start. So actually, particularly in the refugee community, financial inclusion also plays a huge role. And then finally, a while back, I was involved with a UK government initiative around financial inclusion, and I was personally horrified as a mother of 3 children to understand that you actually learn your financial habits between the age of 5 and 7. So, you know, quite frankly, we need to be thinking about education and how do we actually build these financial skills in very early within our education system.
Great, thanks so much, Louise. I'm just going to check with anyone else on any of those groups of questions. If not, we'll move on. And if we start here and then move back, there's a guy in the red tie and then lady behind.
Thank you very much, Bobby. First point, I hope you send to every member of the new cabinet a synopsis of what's being said. They need to look at it and put down a challenge and act on it. Could I just touch on something that Louise has indirectly mentioned? It's very controversial, immigration. Now, Sir Myles talked about political will. Absolutely agree with you. I think there is a total lack of it on this issue. How would each member of the panel advise the new government to persuade the electorate that there is another way of discussing immigration, and it is not just hostile, intolerant, and on occasions downright racist?
Thank you very much. Great question. And just behind you, the lady next.
Hello there. I'm Pippa, and I am actually working as a fundraiser at King's. And as such, I am really privileged to see huge generosity and the impact of that, particularly on things like wealth inequality in my day-to-day. And I was just wondering if I could get the panel's thoughts on what you see the role and responsibility of individual and corporate philanthropy in conjunction with broader systemic and governmental change.
Great, very great specific question, and there's a guy there.
Yes, good morning. Carl Wright, Secretary General Emeritus of the Commonwealth Local Government Forum. In my work, I've seen some terrible poverty in Asian slums, African rural areas, and some of the low-lying, deprived Pacific islands. And one thing I haven't heard so much from the panel, which I'd like to raise, is the issue of localizing SDGs. And specifically, OECD and some other policy institutes have calculated that of the 169 SDGs, at least 100 have to be implemented at the local or local government level, not the national level, not the international level. And I wonder if the panel could address that issue, because clearly, I think, as well as acting globally or indeed nationally, and I appreciate the UK is probably one of the most centralized countries with everything being decided in Whitehall, and I think we'd probably have a slightly different debate if we were in Germany or Japan or South Africa on the issue of local engagement. But should we be acting a bit more locally as well as thinking globally or nationally?
Great, great. Very good point. Great, well, let's start from the top of those, actually. Immigration, a more positive frame or discussion around immigration. Anyone? Yeah. Oh, Stella, then Shabna.
Thank you. So, I mean, that's definitely an interesting one, but I think the way that we come at it is that, so this is from the diaspora angle, because the point is that once you have people come in, they become obviously part of the society, but they also give back. And so we focus very much on the contributions of migrants and the diaspora. And I think this is an area that a lot of people locally or the electorates don't really understand or know about. And I think raising the conversation around that and providing a bit more stats around how diaspora and migrants give back, but also not just giving back to their countries of heritage, but also giving to the community here as well. And we don't see those stats at all. I mean, within the NHS, I mean, I don't know what the stats are, but we know that we have a significant number of diaspora, who are within these health professions. I think during COVID, some of this was elevated a bit more, and we could see that a bit more, but that seems to have died down. But there needs to be a lot more done around providing data around how diaspora communities and migrant communities are benefiting, the society here, and in various different ways, through the healthcare profession, through, entrepreneurship and so forth. You go to different parts of London, for example, and you can see the evidence of this, and it's really important to begin to elevate that and to show the connection also between the two as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Stella. And I know that you have to go and catch a flight, so don't feel you have to stay. Don't miss your flight. Thank you, Stella. Suzanne.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah.
I was just going to say, it is possible to have these kind of difficult conversations on contested topics that are highly polarised as well. But I think it's how we have the conversations that's important. So I just wanted to give a bit of a plug for some methods as well, and the importance of deliberation on topics like this. We've recently just done some citizens' juries and assemblies on the topic of immigration, and I'll share with you the findings. But certainly we went into them very concerned that people would just spend the weekends shouting at each other, but actually what they did was engaged in realistic and very measured and very calm debate. It was very constructive, and they came up with really useful policy recommendations. So deliberation is about giving people time, usually multiple weekends on any given subject. It's about giving them access to impartial and expert information, and it's about exposing them to diversity and plurality of views. I think the most famous example is the Citizens' Assembly on Abortion in Ireland, which paved the way to constitutional reform. But it is possible to have these kind of conversations. It's just changing the frame in which we have them and changing the ways. So I'll send the work that we did to you.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks. And I guess I would echo both what Stella and Suzanne have just said there. I think that we can have the debate in a different way, and I think we should take a much more evidence-based approach to this, and I think that's what's really missing from some of the conversations that we have. We rely on really toxic, polarised narratives which aren't necessarily evidence-based. Some of the work that we did at the Runnymede Trust with a group of academics was to look at some of the polling around immigration and attitudes and public attitudes towards immigration. And when people are asked about immigration as a big national issue, they often raise it as a concern. However, it is deprioritised when they're asked about what matters in their everyday, day-to-day life. It comes much, much lower. And I think that's a reflection of how the mainstream media and political conversation has created this sense that immigration is the cause of some of the problems that we're experiencing on a day-to-day basis. And so I think that really kind of stripping away some of that kind of quite racialized, let's call it racist, narratives that we have around immigration need to be kind of removed from the debate. And then we need to think about what actually is the cause of, for example, if we think about this summer and the racist riots that we saw. Now, the areas that happened didn't necessarily have high migrant communities, but they did have high deprivation. So we really need to think about the material conditions, the kind of austerity, the social infrastructure that has been ripped away from communities through policies of austerity that deny communities the ability to be able to flourish and thrive. And that's what we need to fix, as well as the conversation that we're having around immigration as well.
Correct. Thank you very much, Shabna. And just a couple of sentences from us, just not to extend this too long, but you should also question the extent to which people are that negative or angry about this. Echoing what Shabna says, we run, one of my main areas of study is attitudes to immigration, and we have one of the most positive attitudes to immigrants in the UK in the World Value Survey, which we run compared to other countries. It's how those attitudes are portrayed very often, with only hearing from the extremes. So do have some confidence, actually, that the UK is not what you see in social media in terms of its attitudes to immigration more generally. So then we got a very specific question on fundraising, whether the role of individual and corporate fundraising in achieving this SDG.
Probably comes to me as a corporate on the panel. So I think there is an important role to play, but it's not enough, let's be clear. I mean, we're not going to address the challenges with individual and corporate philanthropy. But I think there's two niches where it has a role to play. One is in high risk taking. That is where you're not going to see public money, unfortunately, taking a lot of risks. You know, that's just a reality. So I think that is where particularly individual philanthropists do and can play a really important role in being willing to fund things which are very risky. The second area on corporate philanthropy, it has a huge role to play, but I think what we've seen over the last 2 decades or so is this important focus on core business. It really needs to link to what the business is about, because then it's really a mutual, you know, it's a kind of win-win, to use that horrendous phrase, for everyone. But it's really so true. In our case, skilling digital skills is a strong focus for us because, again, with our 750,000 people, we're constantly training ourselves, particularly, obviously, currently in AI. So a lot of our focus is on digital skilling and working with other partners that are natural partners of ours, like Microsoft and Salesforce and the other big tech companies. So yes, a role to play, but it won't plug the gap. And so we need to mobilize the private sector and public sector, obviously, as well. And maybe on the SDGs, can I just quickly say, which is the next question? Or did anyone else want to come in on that?
Building on that, I think there's an interesting opportunity for individual and corporate philanthropists to support more work aimed at changing systems. And I think it's often difficult to see that when there's so much immediate need that needs to be met. But that actually, in addition to supporting service provision and the symptoms of our system, I think there's a real need and opportunity for both individual and corporate funders to support work that tries to change the underlying systems and the structural barriers. And I think, you know, on the core business point, which I absolutely agree with, of course, you know, it feels to me that there's a very strong business case for tackling inequality. In terms of all sorts of things, from having a healthy, educated workforce and consumers who can afford to buy and so on. So I think that all links up.
Great. Well, why don't we go straight on to the...
Yeah, so on the localization point, and I think Myles touched on it earlier, and I know that I will say this because he won't. Myles has done a brilliant job of actually banging the drum with the government here about saying we really need to be looking at our voluntary national review, and we really need to be looking at embedding the SDGs into the government departments. And I was at a session hosted by Wilton Park where we heard from the Mexican representative, the Ghanaian representative, and many other representatives about how they are all doing that. But yet we don't seem to be doing that here. So, and I also feel that in terms of the cohesion and us having more of a globalized view, it's also hugely helpful, because if we think about issues like maternal health, you know, it is an issue that we face here as much as we see in developing countries where we talk about it maybe a bit more. So for so many reasons, and I would encourage all of you to really play that role within your community, within your local MP, asking them about the SDGs and the local implementation.
Very good. Yeah, Myles, do you want to pick up?
Just a very quick word on that. So governments are encouraged every 4 years in New York to report back to their peers on what they are doing to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a process called a voluntary national review. Now, underneath that, a number of countries have started to institute VLRs, or voluntary local reviews, which are feeding into that broader VNR process. And we're not doing that in a sort of considered way in this country. What is encouraging, however, is that a number of city councils and authorities are building their own sort of strategies around the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, in my local area, Bristol, for example, has constructed its forward plan very much around the SDGs. And the University of Bath in Bath has put together a document setting out how the local council strategy has reflected the Sustainable Development Goals. That's all very positive stuff, but as Louise has said, you know, I think encouraging politicians to go down this route is really important. Thank you.
Great. Well, we are at time, but I'm going to check with any of the panel in case they've got any final comments or thoughts that they want to do. And I did see loads of hands at the back for further questions, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. But we do have time for circulation and tea and coffee at the back of the room. So do pick up any of your questions or comments or thoughts with the panelists. It says in my notes that I'm supposed to summarise the discussion now, which I really won't attempt to do. You'll be glad to hear, but it was brilliant. Thank you so much. So final points from me is just the thanks, and thanks to the Lord Mayor for setting up this series, brilliant series. Thank you to Alderman Hales for hosting us today. Thank you to the team here at Mansion House and the brilliant teams at King's and the Policy Institute in putting this together. Thank you, all of you, for coming and listening to us today, but also contributing so much. And finally, of course, thanks to our amazing panel. Thank you very much.